So today we're here talking to Michael Ventura, who happens to be my stepfather. Um, Michael Ventura has been a screenwriter, a novel writer, a poetry writer, and a film critic, among other things. We've decided to do a series of interviews about his life because he's had a very interesting life and a very he's lived a lot of different places and known a lot of different interesting people and had a lot of different interesting experiences and has a deep knowledge of American culture, and not just from a secondary standpoint or an academic standpoint, but from a genuine lived standpoint. So today we're going to start with when he started writing and where he was, what America looked like at that time, what the location he was at was like at that time, what the social conditions were like at that time. So why don't we start there, Michael, with that, where you were when you started writing, how you got there, and how you came to the decision that writing is what you wanted to do.
Well, where it started really was reading before writing. And in a first grade in the Bronx, New York, and the city was all I knew. The city was nature to me. People say it's not natural. People who are born in it and grow up in it, especially their first years, and that's all they see, it is a kind of nature. And I remember very well in first grade or kindergarten learning to read. My mother had always read to me, and we listened to the radio shows. I was born in 1945, and there were kid radio shows in the afternoon, cowboy shows, and you listened to them, and I learned how to tell time because my favorite show was on at 4 o'clock, and that's I was being patient to hear it, and my mother would teach me what the clock was and how it was, and that was quite early, like I'm three and a half. So it's 1948, going into 49, and the show comes on, and it's a cowboy show. I don't remember the name of it. There were a bunch of cowboy radio shows. And when it was over, my mother and I would enact the show. We moved the furniture around in our little apartment in the Bronx and do the show. And I'd be the good guy, and she'd be the bad guy, but she'd also be the girlfriend. She'd be all the parts that wasn't the hero, and I'd be the hero. and that that was a thing, like 5 days a week. And in the first grade, I was, as I say, with a kindergarten. I'm really vague on that. I remember very well suddenly understanding the word look. I got incredibly excited because it was really the first word that I just looked at and understood without having to force it out in my mind, or going A, V, learning those words, and then you haven't really learned them. You're just doing what you're told. You're excited. I mean, it is reading. It's a grown-up thing, and you're tiny, but suddenly I looked at a word that happened to be look, and I just saw it and knew what it was. And it was very, very exciting. And the next thing that happened was right afterwards, when all the words on the page just kind of came to attention, and I could understand them. It was like they'd been at ease, and suddenly they were at attention. And from look, I could read any of the other words in that first grade level book. And it was very handy because then my mother had the twins, and she had no time from. She went from having all the time in the world for me to having zero time for me, which set me out on my own and probably saved my psychological life. But so reading came first. I started reading and reading. And this is right around the time, now we're in the early 50s, when they started tracking on a state and national scale, reading scores, giving reading tests that were standardized reading tests. And from the first, I read off the charts, way above my grade. And though I didn't do schoolwork, though I couldn't spell, though I was very blocked at math, they kept passing me, because in those days, if you didn't get a passing grade, you were left behind. You did the second grade again, or you did the third grade again. But they kept passing me because I was reading several grades above my level. I was reading at about junior high level when I was in the fourth grade. And after that, I was reading high school level. And after that, I was off the charts. And so reading became a big thing to me, became mine. And this was very fortunate because we went from living in a working class district of the Bronx to living in a nicer place in Queens to living in a kind of house. And then I'm 7 years old. My mother went quite insane. My father, I don't know how, he just kind of collapsed, couldn't handle it. And suddenly, we were living across the hall from my aunt in a funky district of Brooklyn. Italian neighborhood mostly. We were Italian, Sicilian. And tough. It was the first tough neighborhood, really tough. And I was not tough. And books became my world. And on the way, my parents' marriage collapsed. We got evicted. And suddenly I had no possessions. I mean, in the morning I had toys and a cat and toy soldiers and like that. And in the evening I had a pocket full of acorns that I collected that day. And I'm not trying to play a violin or anything. This happens to a lot of people. This is not my story in particular. This is a story of what happens when you're in the continual emergency that is poverty. And we ended up, my mother and my two little brothers and my little sister, on a street called Decatur Street in Brooklyn, which was awful, in an apartment that had rats and cockroaches and very little food, and my father saying his $5 go on welfare.
Okay, so let's take a little break from your family for a second and give me an impression of that area in particular, New York, Manhattan, that area in general.
Good question.
In that period of time.
So in this period of time, neighborhoods are very distinct. You have your Jewish neighborhood, your Italian Catholic neighborhood, your Irish Catholic neighborhood. I didn't know a Protestant until I was 12 years old, or later. You had your black neighborhood, you had your brown neighborhood, Puerto Rican, African American, a lot of Southern diaspora African Americans that had come after about 1920. You had Harlem, you had Bedford-Stuyvesant, they were the African American mega ghettos. You had the South Bronx. So you had this mixture of people. You had immigrants. My mother was an immigrant. My uncles, a couple of them were immigrants. My grandparents were certainly immigrants on my father's side, because on my mother's side they died before I was born. everybody felt their ethnicity very much. And the Italians fought the Irish, and the Irish and Italians fought the Jews, and the Jews fought the Irish and Italians. But we were all together. The people classified as more or less white were all together in classes, in schools. At the time, New York City was the largest city in the world. At the time, New York City had the highest buildings in the world. At the time, New York City had more Irish people than Dublin, had more Italians, and certainly more Sicilians than in Palermo, had more Jews than were in Israel at the time. It was and more African Americans and more cohesive African American communities than anywhere in the country. So it was kind of the capital of where these ethnicities were, Puerto Ricans too. Italian Harlem turned into Spanish Harlem. As Italians moved out, they went to the Bronx, and they went to Queens, and they went into Brooklyn, where my Italians, Sicilians. So there was that. There was a distinct religiosity. A lot of Catholics, because the Irish and the Italian and the Germans who come before us were mostly Catholic. A lot of Jews who got the Jewish holiday off. A lot of Southern Baptist, the Black Church, that kind of thing, which as Malcolm X said, the church was the most segregated thing in the country. Sundays at 10 o'clock or whatever it is, people really separated. And so, but there was this presence of religion. You got the Catholic holidays off. You got the Jewish holidays off. Halloween was not yet a big holiday at all. It was just for kids. But Christmas was enormous. Easter was enormous. There was the Easter parade on Fifth Avenue. So there was that presence of religion. There was the sense of everybody we knew was working class. There were no professionals in our families. My father drove a cab and did our jobs.
Are we talking about like the particular neighborhood that you're living in? Are we talking about like tenements, like 5-story tenements or something like that?
3-story tenements, 5-story tenements, where the particular neighborhood where Decatur Street was, we felt abandoned. Now if you look at stuff shot in Brooklyn, you'll see a lot of trees. New York City has had a tree planting program for the last 20 years. You'll notice they're young trees. When, I think her name was Betty Smith, wrote in sometime in the 1920s or so, a tree grows in Brooklyn. She meant a tree grows in Brooklyn. It was, we didn't have that.
But this isn't like, it's not like the Bronx in the late 70s with like tons of vacant lots and stuff, though. It's not like that bad yet, right?
This is tenements. You got on the roof of our tenement on Decatur Street, you could see a long way, and what you saw was clotheslines and TV antennas on tenement roofs the same height as yours. So
would you say that like Last Exit to Brooklyn kind of might be that kind of thing? Like if somebody's read that book, it might be comparable to that?
It wasn't as violent or funky as that. That was that area was right on the waterfront.
Yeah.
Right over the bridge, and not the Brooklyn Bridge, but the bridge that's one bridge up from the Brooklyn Bridge, and can't remember what it is, and that was a much more chaotic poverty. Our poverty,
maybe more like the Wanderers or something, maybe.
Say it again.
Like the Wanderers?
Yes.
Yeah.
The Wanderers. In fact, the Wanderers were shot where we lived in the Bronx in the early '60s, mid '60s. They were shot right there. So you look at the Wanderers and like that. But in the situation in Decatur Street, we didn't have food to eat. We ate mayonnaise sandwiches. We ate cornmeal mush because we were a family without a provider. My mother couldn't go work. She had a practically infant girl to take care of. There was no kind of daycare. There was nothing like that. And in terms of the men in our family, there were male, or in our culture, there were male teachers. Most of them were war veterans, Korea and World War II. And those were interesting guys, most of them. But mostly, as I said, my father was a cab driver. My Uncle Jack was a truck driver. And then he ran a garage. My Uncle Sal was a truck driver. And then he did something else I can't remember, but it was all working class stuff. It was, my grandfather ran painted on the scaffolds and had a crew until he was in his 80s. These weren't, when the women worked, and they didn't work a lot, often, but they were cleaning ladies. They were file clerks, a job that doesn't exist anymore with computers, but they were file clerks. It was a working class environment, and the same was true for everybody we knew. We didn't know anybody who was a doctor, and the only person we knew who had gone to college was my mother.
So did you have a sense at that early age that of class division, or was that just like your whole world was that working class milieu, and you didn't there being like separate classes wasn't like a reality to you yet?
Well, that's an interesting question. There was, my sense of class came like this. My mother had taken us to the museums. In those days, the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Metropolitan Museum of Natural History were free. The idea was to educate the immigrants, and they were free. The zoo, the Bronx Zoo, was free. I think there was a slight fee for the Central Park Zoo. And she took me there when I was very little to all these places. She took us there when she could. The subway fare was not much. I remember when it went from a dime to 15 cents, and I was very offended. You got there, you could have a quarter or 50 cents and go to and from Manhattan and get hot dogs and a soda too, and go to the museums. So, but when we went to the museums, or when we roamed around Central Park, I could see that there were kids not at all like us. They weren't ragamuffins. They didn't have circles under their eyes. They didn't have old clothes or broken shoes. So that's when I found class. I was very aware that there were people who had stuff we didn't have. Even on television, you didn't see a class difference that much. You saw only white people on television, but you didn't see a class difference that much because you had the honeymooners, and they didn't look. The Gleason family didn't look so different than us. You had I Love Lucy, and the father was an immigrant. They didn't seem so different from us. The people who lived next door seemed very much like us, more Irish, but we went to school with kids like that. So class didn't exert itself on me until later.
How much of a... Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. No, go. Ask me a question.
How much of a political consciousness was there in that environment, if there was one, and how did it present itself?
I can't speak from my knowledge at the time. I can figure out things later on. On one hand, from the point of view of later on one hand, I don't think we knew any Republicans.
Yeah.
New York City didn't have many Republicans. Or if they did, they were much better heeled than we were. But it was complicated in my household because my mother and father were communists. And they weren't the kind of communists that they met somebody, they talked to the wrong person at a party and they got blacklisted years later, or they signed a petition for something they thought was just and they got blacklisted for that. No, my parents were, especially my mother, thorough communists. And they did not talk about their politics in English. And they did not let us learn Italian or Sicilian, which are different kinds of languages. They've spoken both. They talked about their politics in Sicilian and Italian.
Okay, so as far as their politics, there was kind of a sense of subterfuge at that time that there was a sense of them keeping it hidden. Is that correct?
What there was a sense of, and I remember this very clearly from age 7 to age 10 especially, there was a sense of fear. Yeah. A sense of fear in the house that I did not understand, which made me very, very, there's nothing more frightening to a 7-year-old than to know his parents are really frightened. And that came out in various ways. Personality changes, short-temperedness, or suddenly I'm left alone in the house for 10 hours. My brothers and sister are nowhere. My parents are nowhere. What the fuck is going on? And I turn on the television with a little fuzzy screen, and I see footage from the war and from when they were cleaning up the concentration camps. I didn't know whether that was around the corner or in the past. I was 7, 8 years old. So there was this sense of what are these people afraid of? Why is everybody acting so strangely? I would find years later that camps were being built here and being reported on in the New York Times for arrests of communist families. But I didn't know that then. My parents never talked about that. It's not even in the whole. You can read about that stuff, about that time in some of the famous books, but they don't talk about the camps. I had to do a whole article of research that got put into a new literary history of America that was put out by Harvard about 10 years ago. I did an essay for that book documenting from the New York Times and other places the building of the camps and what they were for and how public they were, how people knew about them. But that was so fearsome it was buried in the public consciousness. God knows my parents never spoke of it. I learned of it years later. So what I was aware was that my parents were terribly, terribly afraid. And they were doing things that were not legal. It was illegal to be a communist. And if there had been a roundup, we would have been rounded up. I didn't know that until 2 decades later. Didn't begin to know it until 2 decades later. But I felt it. And then my mother had her big breakdown. And then everything changed.
Was there any sense of organized crime in your environment, in that neighborhood? Were you cognizant of that at all growing up there?
I know it flies in the face of a lot of movies, but no.
Yeah.
No, not at all.
Yeah, so
we were kids.
We're just talking about the working class environment, pretty much.
Yeah, and And drugs didn't hit the streets until about 63, 64, 65. They didn't start to hit the streets until then. We're talking about the 50s. Drugs weren't in the schools.
Yeah.
Guns weren't on the streets. You're talking about plenty of violence, plenty of fear, but it was all fists and sometimes knives.
So,
and it was mostly among kids.
That's interesting. As far as drugs, was there was there heroin in Harlem? Like, was there a problem with that in some neighborhoods with hard drugs, or was it just like not a thing back then? Or
well, I can't speak for Harlem because I didn't live there.
Yeah.
But drugs as such were a grown-up thing, wasn't a kid thing.
Yeah.
And it didn't start being something that young people were dealing with and doing all that stuff until the early '60s. Not even so much 61, 62. We're talking about 64, 65, and then everything starts to get really dicey.
Yeah. So how about just violence in general? Was that a part of your environment back then? Like, I mean, street violence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very much so. And if you were not a good fighter, and I wasn't, if you were frail, and I was, you developed what I call street sense, which is not knowing, that doesn't mean knowing who the scams are, who's scamming, and what's going on, all that. That's knowing that violence is possible at any time, and you walk like a little scared animal, aware of every flicker. And that never goes away. Calms down, but once you have it, it never goes away. And it's street, it's poverty, it's, as I say, a continual emergency. The lights are shut off. The phone is disconnected. You get an eviction notice. There's a check that was supposed to come, didn't come, and you're eating mayonnaise sandwiches for dinner. It's winter. You need, because we're kids, we're growing. We need new clothes, new hand-me-downs. There's nothing. So you're cold. You go to school anyway. Some teachers notice and they give a shit. Some teachers don't. But there's not much they can do. There isn't a school lunch program. You have to pay for it. A lot of programs that people take for granted now didn't exist then. Welfare was a joke. How was my mother going to raise 4 children on something like $30 a month?
So, you said that these different neighborhoods, they were kind of divided as far as ethnicity, and I was wondering how much conflict was there between these different neighborhoods? How did that play out?
Mostly, it was tense coexistence. The violence is really exaggerated.
Yeah.
Mostly, it was tense coexistence. Mostly, people might not want to admit it, but mostly people got along. Now, there was a lot of ethnic humor in that time that would melt the microphones now.
Yeah.
And that was considered fine. It wasn't practiced in my home. My mother didn't allow any kind of derogatory words about other races or people, ethnicities, I mean. She just didn't allow that. And we didn't do it. Those words were never in our home. Other people use them, aunts use them, and like that, but not around Claudia. People were scared of my mother. Around my mother, people behaved. And I know you met her when she was a nice little old lady, but she was tough. And so there wasn't, but there was a lot of, it was kind of good natured, but it could turn rough. You know, you frickin' Mick, what are you doing? Oh, you damn wop. Are you kidding? Your mother, blah, blah, blah. Well, your mother, and then that could turn into a fight.
Yeah.
But basically, the wops and the Micks and the Heaves all got along much more than they probably would like to admit.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty similar to how it was for me. So when did cinema become a part of your life? When did you start to be conscious and become a fan of film?
I've been thinking a lot about that recently. Now, my mother, when I was little, took me to movies all the time. There were newsreel theaters, because you have to remember that even on the radio, news was very, very quick. 5 minutes of news, a few headlines, that's it. On TV, once we got a TV, the major networks ran maybe 10 minutes of news a night, maybe not even. News didn't go to a half hour until 1963, when Kennedy got killed. And then they started being broadcast news the way we know it now. But also in the 50s, even on those news shows, even well into the 60s, there wasn't much footage. It was somebody reading the news. There were some graphics, but there wasn't much news footage. It couldn't be developed that fast. So it was pretty primitive. The Kennedy coverage, made it leap ahead, but it was still pretty primitive until the Vietnam War really got going, and there was a lot of footage. And the Civil Rights Movement, and there was a lot of footage. But early on, there wasn't that much footage. My mother would go to newsreel theaters because she was interested in everything. And there was a newsreel theater on Times Square she'd take me to. She'd go to movies. I'd be right with her all the way. I was very famous as a very well-behaved child, a little tiny tot. And she could take me anywhere. I'd keep my mouth shut. I wouldn't cry for food. I wouldn't cry if I made in my pants. It was just be with mom. But when cinema first hit me was 1953. Now, it's hard to believe, but in those days, if you were a bunch of 7-year-olds, 2 or 3 7-year-olds, and you paid your ticket, they let you in. Just don't sit in the smoking section. Kids went to the movies by themselves. Saturday was Kids' Day, and there'd be 10, 15 cartoons, no kidding, I'm not exaggerating, and a Western, a war movie, a monster picture. It'd go from about 9 or 10 in the morning till like 4 or 5 in the afternoon. And you went for a quarter, and you paid your ticket and got a dime bag of popcorn and a 5-cent soda. And there were matrons at the Star on Knickerbocker and Star in Brooklyn. 2 white uniformed matrons with long flashlights who sort of kept order. And if they bopped you on the head with a flashlight, you didn't go home and tell your parents, and because you know what your parents would have said. Good, you probably deserved it. They should have hit you twice. And I'm not exaggerating. That was real. And so, something that would be a famous Western or something, you might see 2 or 3 times because these prints would roam the city, so to speak. And you saw all kinds of stuff. If it was a war movie or a Western or a monster picture, you saw it. And by this time, there were newsreels in those theaters. And the most exciting thing was seeing nuclear bombs go off. Because Russia and the United States and France were testing in in the air like crazy to scare the shit out of themselves, out of each other. And so you saw these things, and you saw, but the movie that had the first one that really socked me, and I'm writing about this now, I'll send you what I'm doing, was War of the Worlds, 1953. And the scene that shocked me was when the scientists think they have a way to defeat the Martians, because the military can't do anything against these guys. And they're loading the truck. I didn't know it was shot in Los Angeles, but it was shot in Los Angeles. They're loading the truck to get out of the city. Any city seemed like my city. Some other neighborhood. And a mob of white guys wants to get the truck to get out of town, to escape the Martian warships. And the mob beats up the scientists, throws them off, throws the equipment off, and it's very clear that mankind has no chance now. And I was terrified of it. This was the scariest thing I ever saw. And one reason I was terrified is because when I was 5 years old, in a fairly decent working class area called Fresh Meadows in Queens, I watched a bunch of 5-year-olds kick another 5-year-old almost to death. I was just horrified. And these were kids with two-parent families. They hadn't seen too much television. Most of them didn't have televisions. They hadn't seen bad movies. They weren't on drugs. They were just human fucking beings who got it into each other to be this little mob suddenly kicking this kid until they got tired. And when I saw the same behavior on the screen with the grown-ups, people who could easily have been parents of these kids or me, I was just terrified because it confirmed something I'd seen in my life. I was seeing something I saw in my life. And it was one of the most frightening moments of my childhood to see that was out there. That behavior was out there. It wasn't just in my neighborhood. It wasn't just among this little confined group. But 1953 was also the year my mother went really insane. And movies started to take on a huge place in my life. My imaginative life was books, movies, books, movies, books, movies. And anything to get away from the reality that I was actually living in.
Give me a little, go down a little side road right now and give me a picture of Times Square at this time.
I don't remember Times Square from this time, but I can give you a picture of Times Square about 5 years later.
Okay.
Times Square by the late 1950s, which was when I first started really roaming around on my own. Times Square was, you had the big first-run theaters, the Winter Garden, and what's the only name of the Paramount. There were lots of Paramounts all around, but that was the Paramount, where you'd have live stuff, but you'd also have movies. You had the Broadway theaters, which were all on the side streets, so you had fancy people going to those, fancy to us. But you also had porn. You had strip clubs. Birdland had turned into a strip club. There was the Metropole, which was a jazz club and then became a strip club. There was porn bookstore. When I was about 14, jumping ahead, first book of poetry that I ever had was a book of poetry I stole from this bookstore. It was E.E. Cummings' 100 Selected Poems. And this store was weird. It had sex shows in the back, like booths.
So this was...
It had all the sexual paraphernalia.
We're talking about...
Right there
We're talking about
Times Square
1960.
1960.
Okay.
It had all this paraphernalia. It was across the street, across 7th Avenue or Broadway from the Times Building, and but it also had a literary section, the poetry, and the novels section, and everybody in there looked like a fucking criminal, and there was me, not understanding what kind of danger I was in. A pretty boy walking around going, wow, and stealing a book of E. Cummings.
All right, well, let's, why don't we jump ahead to your teenage years and just kind of give an impression of that and what, roaming around New York, kind of expanding your horizons, maybe get, going into employment.
I think the story goes slower than that.
Okay, sure.
If you don't mind.
Sure, go ahead.
Wait a second. Thanks. Because I told you about getting evicted.
Yeah.
And then we're in Decatur Street. Now, I had my first books in the 5th grade. This was when we got evicted at the beginning of the 6th grade. My mother had signed me up to a landmark book club, where one book, usually history or science,
Yeah.
made for junior high kids.
Landmark was, they did the biographies, right?
Yeah, a lot of biographies.
Yeah, that was my first.
The first book I ever read on my own was the Wright brothers.
Yeah, the first one I read was a Stonewall Jackson Landmark biography. Yeah.
Yeah, and then suddenly I had nothing, and we were in this terrible apartment, and I got a library. My mother got me a library card, and the library was about a half-hour, 40-minute walk away. But I started getting books out, all kinds of books, and I started stealing books. And so books were becoming way more important to me than daily life. One of the first historical books I read on my own, it wasn't a landmark book. It must have been 1957, because the Hungarian Revolution was in 1956. And James Michener, who was very famous at the time, had written a book about the Hungarian Revolution called The Bridge at Andua, Andua, I think. And it was a grown-up journalist book. It was a paperback, kind you could put in your back pocket. I stole it off a newsstand, and it was the first time I was exposed to torture, reading about the torture of these people being interrogated. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe people did that. It was horrifying. The other horrifying book was I read Bram Stoker's Dracula. I believed every goddamn word of it. And it was a terrifying book. But I was reading like this, and anything that caught my eye. There were a lot of memoirs of World War II and even World War I in these little paperbacks. There were paperback companies that lived on these memoirs. God is my co-pilot, To Hell and Back, Spitfire, Samurai by a Japanese fighter pilot, etc. I read all of that. And so reading written word, Bruce Catton's History of the Civil War, of the Army of the Potomac, The Stillness of Appomattox, etc. They were in paperback at the newsstand, and I'd steal them or I'd buy them. They weren't like 35 cents, and I became aware that, like, Bruce Catton's prose was better than James Michener's. and then, right around then, I began carrying a notebook, little notebook. I've carried a notebook ever since. Had a notebook and something to write with, and started jotting down things that I was seeing. And my mother noticed this. And she said, "What are you doing?" I don't remember exactly the dialogue, you understand, but it was the kind of thing where she said, asked me what I was doing, and I was writing something down, and along with the fact I was writing something of my own with it, some comment, and I was by this time 12-ish, and she said, "Remember, words are music." And that struck me so deeply. And from then on, I was trying to write. And then in the 8th grade, I'm still living in Decatur Street. Or my mother went insane, and then we were living on Myrtle Avenue. I was going to junior high school. I was in the 8th grade by now. And we had a wonderful teacher. I didn't know this until years later. It was her first year teaching. She looked like Marilyn Monroe. She really did look like Marilyn Monroe. And she kind of hypnotized us by walking in. And she's our English teacher. And she was a fresh teacher with fresh ideas, really green, but she got away with it because she was so sincere. We just loved her. And she had all of us write 5 words on 5 pieces of paper. And she went around with the basket. We all put the words in. She went around with the basket. We all plucked 5 words out, about 25 kids. And she told us to write to the end of the period using those 5 words. And unbeknownst to us, she entered these in a writing contest, an inter-school writing contest. And we were not supposed to be a smart class. 8-1 was the smart class. We were 8-5 out of about 10 classes. We were smack in the middle. And 8-1 had apparently prepared for this and all this. But I won first prize, and Joe Giussini won second prize, and Arnie Kurse won honorable mention. 8-1 got all the prizes. I played hooky the day of the assembly, so I didn't know. Because I often played hooky and went to a movie. They didn't care as long as you gave them. You know, they knew you were playing hooky. They didn't give a damn. You bought the ticket. They were fine. Don't sit in the smoking section. And I came in on Monday, and Geraldine Geraci, the only natural blonde in the school, because her mother was Polish, said hello to me. And Johnny Russo said hello to me. He'd been in reform school. He was the most respected guy in the class. And I thought, oh my God, I'm really in for it. What's going on? And Maria Tombino and Jenny Sirica and Joe Giussini, everybody was being nice to me. Mr. Cerebisi, our homeroom teacher, who was a tough guy, was being, Ventura, well, you won. And I go, what the fuck? And I'd won the contest. But more than that, they were proud of me. 8-5 had won the motherfucker. The Protestants in 8-1 were supposed to win the motherfucker, and 8-5 won the motherfucker. And it was remarkable. And I didn't have anything. Right then, I mean, Jenny Sirica said hello to me, Geraldine Geraci said hello to me, I'm going to be a writer. And I swear, it wasn't more complicated than that at the time. This was the first recognition I had ever had in my life for something I did that was out of me. And they were proud of me. They were proud of me. An incident happened after that on the schoolyard. Not long after I was reading a book, because I always read books. I had a book with me wherever I was by that time, and I was reading a book. It was recess. I didn't play with other kids. I wasn't a Goomba. Because of the books and because of my mother, I had a very good vocabulary. And sometimes kids made fun of this. Sometimes even teachers made fun of it. So I was not one of the gang. But I admire, sometimes they thought I was looking down on them, but I was always looking up at them. I wanted to be like them. I felt bad for not being like them, very bad. And there was this guy, Artie Mercier, and he was vicious. People feared him because he was bad. Johnny Russo was tough. And maybe he'd mess with you, and maybe he wouldn't, but he wasn't mean. He was just exerting his toughness, his authority. Artie Mercier was bad. He'd try to hurt your eyes if he fought you. He'd try to damage you. He stayed out of his way because he was crazy. And Artie Mercier is coming. And Johnny Russo wasn't with them, I don't think. But it was him and a bunch of people, a bunch of guys. There was maybe 8 guys. I don't want to exaggerate. There might have been more, like a dozen. It's like the whole fucking army was coming after me. And I was just sitting there reading. I saw them coming, and I kept on reading. They surrounded me. I was sitting with my back against the fence, and they surrounded me, and I kept on reading. They took the book away from me. I just waited quietly. I think they took that for some kind of bravery. It was just, this is what's going to happen to me. I'm not going to help it happen. And Artie Mercier starts taunting me. And then one of the guys, a guy who I didn't know, but a guy who had respect, he says, they called me Four Eyes because I had glasses by then. He says, leave Four Eyes alone. He's the only one of us who's going to make it out of here. And they left me alone. And that taught me a really, really important thing, which was that these people knew what was happening to them. You asked about class. They knew what was happening to them. They knew they were being treated as flotsam. They knew they were fodder. They knew they'd fight the next war or work in a lowly job. They knew that's what they were here for. They knew that's the only reason the city cared whether they could read or not. And their fathers were workers, and their fathers' fathers were workers, and they knew what the deal was. Instinctively. I don't mean they had an idea in their heads, but instinctively they knew. And they knew that because of what I could do, I could get out of it. He said it clear as I've never been more surprised. I was expecting a beating, and what I got instead was respect, because I could get out of it.